Now on to our next presenter. Dr. Carmen Dixon is a professor at Capital University, is passionate about connecting more women to the fields of science, engineering, mathematics, and technology, organizes Capital's Girls in Science Day every year, and has a story to share with you. So please welcome to the HINGES conference, Carmen Dixon.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful lead-in, I guess you're going to hear from. I'm not a scientist, I'm a science teacher, and so I'm going to bring you kind of another lens to that. I was raised in a family of strong women, and I was never in my mind that because I was a woman, I could not do anything that anybody else could do, and that included in the church and in ministry. In fact, my mother has been a licensed minister. My aunt is currently a pastor, a co-pastor of their church. And so what I started finding out in my identity as a woman, and especially then as a science teacher, is that I started doing the Girls in Science Day, and I did my dissertation, and a lot of women do have issues with either confidence, they feel like they're not as good at science, or they don't have a place there. And so this was fascinating to me, and this led up to the Girls in Science Day. And as I started learning more about this and reading more about, I'm kind of a little bit OCD, and I wanted to know the facts. Tell me the facts. Because growing up in a religious home and in a religious environment, I heard a lot, well, women, they're meant for the kitchen, and then even in the church, sometimes I joked around I was going to write a brochure or a book called Women, Bring Meatballs to the Potluck. That's what you do, but it's not. And so I wanted to see what the Bible says about that and to see how that impacts my gender. Because I want to know, I listen to what society says, and we all do, but I want to know what is written, what God has actually said, and the context it is said, and the implications of the language it was said in. And so that's what I'm looking at here when I'm talking about the impact, the biblical impact on the female gender. I wanted to know, society makes such that women, it started with Eve in the fall, and sometimes women can tend to take the blame, be the scapegoat. And so what I wanted to do, I read a lot of literature, I did a lot of research, and I am hopefully going to publish this eventually. It's a long project. But I believe in the beginning that God created Adam and Eve as equals. And that this concept of gender, God was genderless, he is not a physical presence. And so some people say that is not true, that since Adam was created before Eve, that gave him authority over her. And frankly, if that's true, if we follow that line of thought, well, the animals were created before Adam was created, so does that not mean if I were to follow that line? And so there's several things, Bible terminology and the language that it was written in, and I'm going to be honest with you, foreign language was never my subject, and so I guess maybe I'd never seen it applied the way I can apply it here, and that's why it finally hooked me. So the Bible refers to man as them, and so let us make man in our own image, our own likeness. Man is a general term for human beings and encompasses both male and female. And you look at some of the actual words and the pronouns that the Bible was written in, they are not the same as we take them to be now, to include just man and not woman and so forth. It is very different. And unfortunately, what people tend to do is take the Bible and distort according to what the view that they want to present. I'm sure you've never heard of anyone doing that with anything in politics. And so, for example, I'm sorry, I can't resist. The word helper, for example, is one of these words that the meaning has gotten distorted. So, for example, the Bible uses the word, I will make a suitable helper for man. Today, we say that the definition of a helper is one that helps, referring especially to an unskilled, inferior labor, doing the manual labor or kind of the hard part. And frankly, the Hebrew word for helper, that doesn't refer to that at all. We don't know that. Nobody ever explained that to me before. And the word that they use doesn't refer to a subordinate or an inferior person, but it's used to refer to God himself when he helps his people. And so while people have taken that and want to say, well, women is the helper and they're supposed to, that's not true at all. And so once I saw this, I was just astounded. And I want to hear more about this. And I want to know more about these that we've taken and we've run with them when that's not actually, and if you look at the language of Hebrew, how it was presented. So, another issue, let us make mankind in our image and our likeness. God transcends both genders. They are comprehended within his being. I've done a lot of study, and there again, if you look at in that word, our image, our likeness, mankind does not refer to the gender of male alone. God is genderless. It refers to both equally. And so a lot of talk I hear, being the veteran of many Bible schools and Sunday schools and whatnot, I hear a lot of times Eve get blamed for the sin and why they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And so a lot of questions that are asked are, why did the serpent approach Eve rather than Adam? And people, well, she was dumber, she was naive. And did Eve sin or was she deceived? And did Adam choose Eve over God? Well, her vulnerability was not from her gender. God communicated to Adam that he was not to eat of the tree. This was before Eve ever got there. Eve did not hear this from God in person. Eve got this knowledge from Adam instead. And so Adam had a lot of history with God that Eve was not, he told her about it, but she was not there to witness it. And so Eve could have been a victim of second-generation believer fade-out syndrome. For that reason, that's if you think about it, that's a thing. And for that reason, the serpent was wise and he approached her instead of Adam. If that was the truth, one of them had heard from God, don't do this, and one of them didn't, that's probably the one I would go for, if that were me. So, Adam wanted to please Eve greatly. And, Adam, he was there when she ate the fruit. He could have said, I'm not going to eat it anyway. He could have physically tried to grab it out of her hand, but he just submitted to her will and ate it, even though he knew firsthand from God he was not supposed to. There brings up the question, and some scholars say, was Adam really just, he wanted the fruit in his heart, and he watched her eat it, and he was just, that was enacting his own, he wanted to be emancipated from God and be his own. That's kind of up for debate. I don't really have a statement on that, but I think it's a very interesting thought, and I'd like to approach that sometime. And so then we see about how they take the blame. And they were of one flesh, one unit, and actually, before the sin, God always addressed them together as one. They were never addressed individually. That changed. And when he questioned them, they each answered. He addressed them separately, and that indicated that's our first clue, they're no longer of one flesh. And Eve said, the serpent deceived me and I ate. She admitted it. Adam said, the woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree and I ate it. I've taught for 14 years, okay? I've heard that a lot, that sort of theory. You put her here, and so I think it's interesting that Adam attempted to shift, I think he attempted to shift part of the experience onto God. But it's really your fault because you put the woman here. And I mean, you think that is so new. It's back in the Bible. That's not something that my students started this year. Not this year's students did that. All right, grammar and pronouns. There we go. God called out to the man. Adam starts using first person. I heard you in the garden. I was afraid. I was naked. I hid. Not him and Eve anymore. He was talked about just himself. At this point, he was in it for number one, trying to protect himself. And she was kind of, let the chips fall. And so this was really where the separation happened, where man and woman, they were one, and suddenly they come apart. And they're two separate genders, and God starts coming to them separately. For the punishment, God does not use the word curse in Eve's punishment. The equality of man and woman together caring for the garden, that was over. Adam had blamed Eve for his sin. that would make an interesting conversation as they were walking together after he said that to God about Eve. And I mean, what would you say to him if he said that? And so Adam was now the helper and Eve was now the subject. Some authors suggest that Adam would now be predetermined to rule over Eve and suppress her desires. I think it's interesting. God said, your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. And so in the Old Testament, after that, the word used for husband and father was now Baal, which means master, owner, and lord. Before that, that particular word was not used. The status of women, the status of women was quickly deteriorating. They were not the ruling. It was the ruling father, the patriarch. The role of the man was greatly emphasized. And so also throughout society, after that, even great leaders, Martin Luther had quotes about women and their duties in the home, and that was where they fell. And so I think it's interesting to know that they started of one flesh, and it took 6 generations from Adam to Lamech for polygamy, and the world could become a mini monarchy, and King Solomon had a harem of 1,000 wives and concubines. That's about as far from one flesh as you can get. Society has believed, and not everybody, I don't mean everybody does, but as a whole, that women have less physical strength, less mental capacities. And I would say, yeah, I know they say that, but as a science teacher for 14 years, I primarily taught physics and chemistry, and I can tell you, I taught all freshmen, and I had every freshman in the building. When it came to take the electives, such as physics and chemistry, the number of young ladies signing up for that dropped way down. As I interviewed them more for my dissertation, I can't do that, that's not for me. I'm not that as smart as him. And there were just many, sadly, depressingly, many times that happened. And so I think after doing my dissertation and finding that, what I want to do, another thing to do, is talk about women's roles. And as a woman, I am a Christian, and I follow the Lord Jesus Christ. But I'm also a woman, and I also believe in the rights of women, and I believe that God has called me to do certain things. Not to be a pastor in this case, but to be a teacher and to be a science teacher. And so this has a happy ending. It really does. In my project, I believe that this was the distortion that we made of God's message. God brought women and men as equals. And then when Jesus Christ came, he started having new behaviors and new radical ideas of dealing with women that were actually not radical at all. They actually connected back to when God created them equally. And so future research, I want to write about those examples in the Old Testament and the New Testament, the way Jesus treated women, and look at a brief history of feminist methodology and talk about what I believe makes a Christian feminist and how we can be the women that God has called us to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon, for your words and your willingness to share.